Hello, everyone in the greater Medford area, all of our parishioners from Sacred Heart and St. Joseph in Jacksonville. This is the weekend of July 26th, and we celebrate the 17th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Before I share a message with you, just one update regarding coronavirus. It was announced at the end of this past week, I think on Friday or Thursday, the governor announced that she was reducing the attendance limit to a hard number of 100 or less. In our case, we had set our limit at 125, which was about a quarter of our fire code, but now we are having to operate under this new limit of 100. So it shouldn't disrupt things for us too much, but we have our greeters or our ushers at the door with counters now. And when the number hits 100, we're directing people over to our parish hall. So hopefully you won't have any difficulties with that. We stay flexible and we adapt as these new policy changes come. Anyway, with that, let me jump into this weekend's reading and just to leave a simple thought with you to think about. The gospel reading comes from Matthew chapter 13, from verses 44 and following. I'm just going to read the first portion of it. Jesus said to his disciples, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure buried in a field, which a person finds and hides again. Out of joy, goes and sells all that he has and buys that field." It goes on to give a couple of other metaphors about the kingdom of heaven, but that one in particular struck me. Many of you who know me well, you know that as a lay person in my civilian years, I was a businessman. I worked in the Pacific Rim. I lived in Japan for a number of years, and I traveled extensively all through Asia. And this particular metaphor called to mind an image for me from my days of traveling in China. And maybe some of you are familiar with this place, but I took an opportunity once in the early 2000s to take 2 or 3 weeks and travel through China. And this included a trip to central China. One of my coworkers had an interest in archaeology, and they wanted to visit the city of Xi'an, where the terracotta soldiers were discovered. Some of you may be familiar with these, but the story anyway traces back to the early 1970s to a group of farmers working in a field. They were actually digging around and they were attempting to dig a new village well for their town. Almost immediately as they were digging down, they started striking this rust-colored soil that was very much unusual for their location. It's not the kind of soil that they would expect to see that deep, but they kept digging, and after about 5 days of digging, they broke into what turned out to be an ancient tomb, something near 6,000 years old, but from one of the early dynasties. I believe it was the Qin dynasty. They had an opportunity to crawl down into this tomb, and they discovered to their surprise rows and rows of clay, red clay soldiers, statues that were standing in parade formation as though marching off to war. And there were thousands of these soldiers discovered, along with clay horses and clay chariots. And it turned out to be an attempt from the ancient set of beliefs that when they put this emperor to rest, these were meant to be his army in the afterworld. Every single one of these soldiers, by the way, is entirely unique. So it is thought that each one represented a live model, that they actually used real people to model the details after. And anyway, they're still uncovering more of this. But if you go to sites about the terracotta soldiers that are run by tourists and generally run by the Chinese government, one of the details that they leave out that they've very carefully erased and polished over is the fact that these treasures were discovered during the Cultural Revolution, which ran from the mid 60s to the mid 70s of China. This is the rise of the communist movement, and during that time, Mao Zedong uh, made this kind of a push to try and, I guess you could say, create a villain for the movement to gather around and against, and those were, in his case, the wealth of the emperors and the ancient history of China. And so these mobs were rising up, and people were instructed to try to destroy all things historical: imperial palaces, temples, imperial art. It was an attempt really to wipe out some of that early history in favor of a great leap forward, in favor of what Mao was convinced would be a glorious rising up. So pushing out everything that had come before to create space for this new communist movement that he had. What is very disturbing about it, by the way, is it sounds exactly like what's going on in our streets in America today, as people are attempting to wipe out our history and destroy statues and memorials and buildings. So it should be cause for alarm, because history is repeating itself. Hopefully it won't fully repeat itself, because during the Cultural Revolution, ultimately several million people lost their lives. But the point I want to make here is this discovery that these Chinese farmers made. They realized it was precious. It was a treasure to them, but they also realized that if they informed the government about it, it would be destroyed. And so they chose to protect it. They chose to cover the tomb back up and wait for a time in which it might be safer to bring those items forward. Today, that tomb is referred to as the eighth wonder of the world, and I got a chance to go inside that tomb and see many of these works. Some of these statues have traveled and been on display in various major museums throughout the world. But it turns out to be a perfect match, virtually, of today's gospel, that these workers in the field finding a precious treasure and doing everything they could to protect and preserve it. And Jesus' point in telling that story was that we need to treat our faith like that. We need to treat the wisdom of God, the ways of God that He's instructed us with in divine revelation, as though it were the most precious of treasures, and protect it at all costs against the assaults that come in our own times. So we should take stock. Sometimes I think we take for granted too much this gift of faith that we've been given, but really we need to guard it against the challenges that we're seeing in our country today. So as we continue to pray for our nation and for a return to a spirit of peace and unity, let's pray for those misguided souls who are out there trying to wipe out our history, and let's take stock in our own gift of faith and make sure that we have a proper appreciation for it and a focus on how best to use it for our own times. God bless you, and have a wonderful week.